Week 12 of the fantasy football season. Here's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking this week. Number 1, Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. It's been a great season for Puka Nacua. I know last week it wasn't a big game for him, but this week with Tampa Bay coming in, and also he hasn't been 100% with the ankle injury on and off his Nacua this season. I think he goes out there, has a big game. Number 2, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. So last week he was bottled up. It was a bad weather ball game, windy, cold out there in Philadelphia. And this week back indoors at home after a bad loss in Philadelphia and the New York Giants coming in where they can't stop anyone. I think St. Brown bounces back in a big way with a big game. Number 3, Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks, one of the better and consistent receivers all season long in fantasy football. This week, a pretty good matchup at the Tennessee Titans. And JSN, pretty much every week you could pencil in for 100-plus yards and possibly finding the end zone. Number 4, Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. So last week was a tough game for Kansas City. They didn't find the end zone much in that one. And Rashee Rice, he's been solid since he returned to the lineup off suspension a month ago for this Kansas City Chiefs team. So this week back home at Arrowhead is his Chiefs team. Indianapolis Colts coming into town where their defense has been hit or miss. But I know Sauce Gardner possibly could be shadowing Rashee Rice the majority of this game, but even with a tough corner matchup in this one for Rice, I still think he's one of the better receivers in the league, and especially playing with Patrick Mahomes, even if Gardner's on him in this ball game, I don't think it's a problem. Number 5, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. Nico Collins, the last few weeks, he's been getting things going and putting up big numbers with Davis Mills in there, quarterback, and once again, Mills is going to start this game here on Thursday Night Football. CJ Stroud out, and he had a bad concussion now, missing 3 games. And Buffalo, their defense has been leaky all season long. I know they're dealing with a lot of injuries, but Nico Collins, one of the better route runners in the league, and a guy just finds ways to make plays and put points on the board. Number 6, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. So this week a tough matchup for Dallas after they went into Vegas and put up an offensive explosion in that game, scoring 33 points. CeeDee Lamb, George Pickens both had big games in that one, but this week could be a tight covered ball game versus Philadelphia, one of the better Ds in the league. But still, CeeDee Lamb's a matchup-proof wide receiver. Number 7, Emeka Egbuka of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Egbuka last week, it was a down game for him, only 9 fantasy points after he came off 115-yard touchdown game versus New England in Week 10. So this week could be another high-scoring game at the Los Angeles Rams, where their defense, we know, is a solid unit of the Los Angeles Rams. But I think this could be a high-scoring game between these two teams, and I could see Egbuka bouncing back. Number 8, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. So Ja'Marr Chase, he suspended 1 game. He didn't make the list. I know he appealed the suspension, but the evidence obviously is there that he spit on Jalen Ramsey to get points. So even if he plays Ja'Marr Chase, then you will put him a top 1 to 3 option. But right now, it's not looking good. He's going to play and just get the suspension this week versus New England. So Higgins will step in to that number 1 wide receiver role. And we saw Higgins once again last week go out there and find the end zone. So this week, if he's the number 1 option, he's going to get peppered with targets in this game and work his way into a big one, most likely with all that volume. Number 9, Davante Adams of the Los Angeles Rams. So Adams been a touchdown machine in his first season with this Los Angeles Ram team. And this week, a great matchup versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where their defense gives up a lot of yards. And we've seen receivers all season long go out there and have big games. So this week, in a potential high-scoring game, I think Adams, I know last week he only had the 1 catch for the touchdown. He'll go out there, have a better performance. Number 10, George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys. George Pickens, last week, him and Lamb were benched the first drive of the game for Dallas, and then after that, he took off with a monster game at the Raiders. 9 catches, 144 yards, and found the end zone. So this week, obviously, a tougher matchup versus one of the better defenses in the league in the Philadelphia Eagles. But these receivers in Dallas, Lamb and Pickens, one of the better 1-2 combos in the league. So this week, even in a tough matchup, Pickens, he's just been great all season long and still has great upside. Number 11, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. He's definitely had a down year. Him and J.J. McCarthy can't get on the same page. Jefferson, he's dropped some passes as well. And it's frustrating all season long for this Minnesota Viking team. But I think he's due, Justin Jefferson, to go out there and finally break out with a big game, because he's failed to reach 25 or more fantasy points at all this season. So his best game was early in the year with a 20 fantasy point game. So this week at the Packers, one of the better defenses in the league, I still think Jefferson could find the way and be a decent option. But obviously he's not lived up to the first round pick he was in most fantasy drafts. Number 12, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. And Chris Olave, it's been a solid season for him, and I wish he traded a few weeks ago to the Seattle Seahawks. That opens up even more targets for him. This week, a good matchup versus the Falcons, where their defense isn't really that good, and they've been giving up a lot of points of late. So Olave going to get peppered with targets, and health has only been the issue for him throughout his career, where we know he's been a talented wide receiver. When on the field, 13, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. So Michael Pittman, it's been a bounce-back season, obviously, for him and this whole Indianapolis Colts team. So this week, tougher matchup at the Kansas City Chiefs. It's possible McDuffie's going to be covering him or Alec Pierce a majority of the game. But Michael Pittman, Daniel Jones, they're locked in. They're coming off a bye week as well, is this Indianapolis Colts team. And I think Pittman, especially with 4 teams on bye and guys banged up and Chase suspended, still a top 13 option. 14, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. So maybe I'm higher on A.J. Brown than consensus. Last week he got peppered with targets in that game. Him and Hurts didn't connect a whole lot, but this week another good matchup at the Dallas Cowboys, where they got one of the worst secondaries in the league, in my opinion, is Dallas. Trevon Diggs, he's still out. DaRon Bland, it hasn't been a good season for him. Malik Hooker, I know, returned at safety last week. But even with all those guys back, and I know Brown week 1 didn't do much versus defense, him and Hurts, they're going to get on the same page, I believe. And Brown's had a good track record majority of the games he's versus Dallas over the last few seasons, while he's been with Philadelphia. 15 to Tor McMillan of the Carolina Panthers. McMillan finally had that breakout game last week. 8 catches, 130 yards, and 2 touchdowns at the Atlanta Falcons. This week, Monday Night Football at the 49ers. We know their defense is without Nick Bosa, Fred Warner for the season, but 49ers defense still going out there. They're making plays, but Tor McMillan was the number 1 receiver taken in the NFL draft for a reason. He could run all the routes, big play, jump ball type of wide receiver as well. And last week we saw the type of talent he has. So if Bryce Young could keep it improving, obviously McMillan's numbers will go up as well as the weeks go on. 16, Stephon Diggs of the New England Patriots. Diggs, he's having a nice season in his first year in New England. And also remember, he's only 13 months removed from a torn ACL, and he hasn't missed a game all season long. Him and Drake May are locked in. We know Drake May is the type of quarterback that's going to spread that football out, get everyone involved in the offense. And this week at Cincinnati, a defense that can't stop anyone. I think Stephon Diggs goes out there, has a big game this week. 17, Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. It's been an up and down season for this whole offense. The most consistent guy in the passing game, believe it or not, to me, has been Dallas Goedert. But this week, a good matchup at the Cowboys. Like I said earlier, their defense can't stop anyone. Devonta Smith, he could run all the routes. He's had a great track record as well versus Dallas. For speedy wide receivers, they've had trouble all season long, and they do give up the 3rd most fantasy points to wideouts on the season. So this week in Dallas, fast track indoors, I think he has a good game as Smith, and a bounce back after last week. He didn't do much. 18, Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. So the second half of the year, he's back to putting up numbers like he did last season as Williams. And now with Dan Campbell calling the plays the last 2 games, he's found the end zone twice in those ball games as JMO. So this week, a great matchup versus the Giants. Home game where this offense is more explosive indoors in Detroit than they are on the road. And I think Williams goes out there once again, and there's a good possibility he finds the end zone for the 3rd straight game. 19, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. So this week, a great matchup versus the Jets. Flowers, 10, 15 fantasy points weekly. He's going to give fantasy owners. The only thing with him is he just don't find the end zone. But like I said, it's a great matchup, and he's been a consistent receiver as the number 1 option in this passing game. 20, Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears. So this week, mediocre matchup versus Pittsburgh. We know they got good corners. Jalen Ramsey, Demarius Slay. We'll see, though, if Ramsey plays in this ball game. But Odunze, the last month of the season, 1 good game, 1 bad game, where last week, once again, it was a nothing game for Odunze. But this week versus Pittsburgh, I think they're going to go back to Odunze in this one. He's a good play wide receiver, and I think he goes out there and bounces back. 21, Marvin Harrison of the Arizona Cardinals. Marvin Harrison, he was out last week, but I think he's got a good possibility returning from the injury. I know Michael Wilson, he broke out with a monster game last week, but I don't think it affects Harrison that much. Wilson all season long was a non-factor for fantasy football until last week. He got peppered with targets and was the number 1 option in the passing game. So this week in a matchup with Jacksonville, they got a leaky secondary. This could be a potential high-scoring game, and Jacoby Brissett's throwing that football all over the yard, and we've seen Harrison's numbers go up with Brissett in the lineup compared to Kyler Murray. 22, Alec Pierce of the Indianapolis Colts. Alec Pierce, he's having a breakout season, and that's all it took, a quarterback change for Pierce to go out there and reach full potential. And also, it's in a contract season where obviously there's more incentive to go out there and obviously perform and try to get a big payday in the offseason. So this week, definitely a tougher matchup at the Kansas City Chiefs. Well, Pierce, he's a wide receiver that's got the height. He's got the matchup advantages, obviously. He can run the routes, and also a guy that could go out there, burn a secondary or the deep ball, and get that jump ball in the back of the end zone. So with all those factors, even in a tough matchup at the Chiefs this week, I like Pierce as a solid receiver 2 for owners. 23, Jauan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. Jauan Jennings, he's been solid the last month of the season. He's been banged up, but playing through injuries, fractured ribs, bad shoulder, some ankle issues as well. And this week, a pretty good matchup versus Carolina, and this offense is finally healthy. Kittle's been back the last month of the season. Purdy returned last week, and this week with a good matchup versus the Panthers, I like Jennings again to go out there and have a good game. 24, Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Brian Thomas, it's been an underwhelming season. He's definitely been a bust where he was going late first, early second in most fantasy leagues after he went over 1,000 yards and had a big touchdown season last year. But this week, it looks like he's going to be back in the lineup. He practiced all week, limited last week. I think they were holding out one more week. And this week, it's a good matchup to come back where Arizona's secondary isn't all that great. And it's an indoor game as well on the fast track on the turf. 25, DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So we'll see if it's Rodgers in the starting lineup. Well, obviously Mason Rudolph, where Rodgers has the left wrist injury. But either way, Metcalf has failed to reach double-digit fantasy points the last 3 weeks. This week, a middle-of-the-pack matchup at the Bears. But if it's windy and the weather isn't great, it's going to be tough to throw the football in that ball game. So with all those factors, and Metcalf's upside's pretty much dependent on scoring a touchdown. He's definitely been dropping down the rankings of late. 26, Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers. So Doubs still operating as the number 1 wide receiver for this Packer team. Jaden Reed, he's going to practice this week, and we'll see if he gives it a go in this ball game versus the Minnesota Vikings. But I think Romeo Doubs, he's more of an all-round wide receiver than Jaden Reed. And Christian Watson last week did find the end zone twice. So with those factors, I still think Doubs, even if Reed comes back into this game, is going to be the number 1 wide out in this game. He's going to get a lot of snaps and looks in this one. And this week versus Minnesota, not a great matchup, but he's a decent flex option. 27, Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings staying in the same game. So Jordan Addison, we know it's been a down season for this whole offense. Jefferson not reaching his potential, obviously, numbers. Hawkinson has been a non-factor, and Addison did miss the first few weeks on suspension of the season, but J.J. McCarthy's just not connecting with these wide receivers, so their numbers across the board are down. Addison did find the end zone last week, but this could be a game where they're trailing early and often and have to chase points. 28, Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. So this week, not a great matchup for Houston. Last week, Shakir, non-factor in that one, where Allen was spreading that football out and everyone was going out there making big plays besides Shakir in this offense. But it looks like Kincaid's going to be out once again in this one, and Shakir has been the number 1 option all season long in this offense in the receiving game. So this week, even in a tougher matchup at one of the better defenses in the league, he's still a receiver 3 flex option. 29, Wan'Dale Robinson of the New York Giants. Wan'Dale Robinson, the number 1 option in this passing game for this Giant team. He's not going to go out there and put up big numbers, but he gets a lot of scammy short routes where he could be a guy weekly, 12, 15 fantasy point range, just on a lot of, like I said, small yard catches, but still catch 7-8 passes at times is Robinson. So this week in a matchup where they'll be chasing points most likely of Detroit, I think he could go out there and have an okay game. 30, Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers. So last week a little limited Pearsall was. He didn't do anything in the ball game was Pearsall, but it was good to see him back. And this week it's a good matchup to get back on track versus the Carolina Panthers, where their secondary isn't all that great. We saw last week Drake London had 100 yards in the first half before he went out with injury versus defense. And I think Pearsall this week bounces back. 31, Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers. So last week, Watson, he had a big game, 2 touchdowns, including a nice catch in traffic, double covered in the back of the end zone at the New York Giants. So this week, a tougher matchup with Minnesota coming into town. But Jordan Love and Watson, they got that rapport. They're going out there making plays. I know, like I said earlier, Jaden Reed possibly could return to the lineup, but I still think Watson's an all-right option this week. 32, Trey Tucker of the Vegas Raiders. So Tucker found the end zone last week. He's the number 1 wide receiver for this Raider team and number 2 option in the passing game behind talented tight end Brock Bowers, obviously. So Trey Tucker Not a great matchup this week versus Cleveland, where possibly Denzel Ward could be covering the majority of this game. But Trey Tucker, like I said, he's going to go out there and make some plays. We saw a monster game from him early in the season where he scored 3 touchdowns. But like I said, he's going to just get volume and targets. And that's why this week he did crack the top 33 Michael Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals. So last week he had a monster game, 15 catches, over 180 yards, and that one was Michael Wilson on 18 targets. But this week, I think Marvin Harrison, like I said, is going to return to the lineup. And also the other thing with Michael Wilson as well, he did nothing all season long. He failed to reach double-digit fantasy points in PPR leagues before the big game last week, and that one versus the 49ers where it was a lot of garbage time. So like I said, Michael Wilson, no doubt, he had the big game. But this week, especially if Harrison's back in the lineup, he's nothing more than a back-end receiver, 34, Jacoby Myers of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So last week he had a decent game with Jacoby Myers. Even if Brian Thomas does return in this ball game this week, he's still going to be lined up as a starter as Myers, where Travis Hunter, we know, is out for the season, and Parker Washington, he's more of a slot and a third or fourth wide receiver. So like I said, Myers, he liked getting traded to Jacksonville. There's a good possibility he does resign in the offseason where he's a free agent. And this week at Arizona, it's a defense that's been getting torched the majority of the season. And on the fast track, I think Myers could go out there and have a decent ball game. 35, Tez Johnson of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He was on a good run, Tez Johnson, with double-digit fantasy points 3 out of 4 games. But last week, a non-existent game. Last week was the Sean Tucker game as well. But this week, indoor game in Los Angeles, always a plus, especially for a hot weather team like Tampa Bay. Maybe the cold last week affected some of these players where they couldn't go out there and do much besides Sean Tucker. So I think this week Tez Johnson bounces back and he's starting in this lineup. Even if Chris Godwin does return to the lineup, I think he'll be limited. And the 36th and final receiver I'm ranking is Darnell Mooney of the Atlanta Falcons. So this week he'll be operating as the number 1 wide receiver. Drake London, he's going to be out with a knee injury. And it's also a good matchup at the Saints, and also now with Kirk Cousins back in their quarterback, where Penix is out with his knee injury as well. Him and Cousins last year had a good rapport. Darnell Mooney had one of his best seasons of his career last season with Kirk Cousins in their quarterback. And this week operating as a number 1 wide receiver, I think he's a decent streaming option, and a guy could go out there and maybe get anywhere from 8 to 10 fantasy points. That's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for week 12 of the fantasy football season.